Hey, Pastor Andy here. I just want to thank you for checking out this resource from Bethel Church. I hope it challenges you and blesses you as you seek to grow in the Lord. You can find resources like this and more on our website. If you are in the Bradenton area, we would love to have you with us for worship on Sunday and come be a part of how God is revitalizing His church for His glory.
They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice. Let Israel be glad.
Thanks, Ray. All right, good morning, Bethel. Well, we're in Psalm 14 today, so if you have your Bible and you haven't made your way there with me, go ahead and do that now. It's crazy to think that it's been 14 weeks since we've been in the Psalms, but here we are. So this is our last week in our Summer in the Psalms series, and we'll pick up 15 next May, next June, somewhere around there. And as we wind this series down this morning, there's been one prevalent theme that I think we've seen throughout the Psalms. So here's going to be Andy's synopsis on this. You guys ready? Life is crazy and unfair and difficult and stressful, right? And the wickedness of what's around us, sometimes within us, rages and makes us question everything. But in the midst, God is still good, and God is still true, and God is still just, and God cares for his people, he protects his people, and he is our refuge. Amen? That is the overwhelming synopsis of Summer in the Psalms so far. But one of the things that impresses me the most is that over the past 14 weeks is seeing how much David loves God and how much David trusts God. Like when we read about David's shortcomings in the Bible, all of his sin and all of the things that he does, all of his idolatries, all these different things, we have a tendency to say, how is that considered a man after God's own heart? Right? But as we have gone through the past 14 Psalms, I'm reminded that's how. By constantly pouring back into God, by constantly going and running back into God, no matter the situation, no matter what's going on, going back into God. And so as someone who has been seriously following Jesus for about 18 years of his life, nominally since I was 6, I suppose, I still believe, thankfully, that God is truly my refuge. That even when I'm at my worst, God is still good, and God still sits in authority over all things, and that all things includes my life, and I'm thankful for that. But I'm going to be honest, there are a lot of moments in my life that I was like, again, going back all these 14 Psalms, there are a lot of times in my life that I look back and said, man, I wish I had the faith of David. Like too many times, as Ray has read, I have felt like the fool and not the faithful. And this is where, from the beginning, we need to remind our hearts about the heart of God and that he is faithful and that he is true and both demand and deserve our affection and our worship. And so as we dive into Psalm 14 this morning, we need to acknowledge the 4 most important words in the Bible. And it's in the beginning, God. Right? If those 4 words are true, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God. If those 4 words are true, then it changes everything. Everything in life, the temporary, the eternal, from life to death, those 4 words, if they're true, which I hold that they are, right? If those 4 words are true, then it changes everything. And if those four are true, then Psalm 14 has what I call the pucker factor that makes our hearts sit on the edge just a little bit, because this morning we're going to see the contrast of those who are the fool and those who are the faithful. And so right now, as I say fool and faithful, I'm going to stop you all right? Because whoever popped into your mind when I said fool, stop it, all right? Because here's the reality. Get them off your brain, because, spoiler alert here, we all fit the mold of the fool sometimes. So you can put your own head into your own mind. Look, when I was growing up, I had a bunch of foolish ideas. All right, anyone else with me? Foolish ideas? All right. I believed some foolish things. I did some foolish things. I said some foolish things. Anybody? Yeah? What are these things, you might ask? So here's just some things that I wrote down that are just ridiculousness, but I think they're fun nonetheless. When I was in elementary school, I grew up in York, Pennsylvania, all right? The thing about growing up in Pennsylvania in your formative years of grades like 1 through 5, you have this amazing thing, winter, right? And so when it's wintertime in Pennsylvania, like they have these awesome things called icicles that hang off the side of buildings. I know you Florida people don't know what this is, right? But these icicles that hang off the sides of buildings and your houses, and me and my friends, we decided we were going to have a profitable endeavor by selling icicles in the middle of winter off my street in Pennsylvania. And so I broke them off, and the bigger the icicle was, the more we would charge. All right? And so I think I had about a 36-inch one that I pulled off my house one time. Me and friends, we were just flabbergasted. It was 3 feet long. We called it the King. I still remember this. This is weird. Sold it for $10. I tried to sell it for $10 in the middle of winter in Pennsylvania off my street. That didn't work out well. All right, there's one. Okay. When I was 12, I knew exactly what the world was about and how the world worked. All right. That's nothing else there. That's just there. When I was 16, I thought that the boombox scene from the movie Say Anything was the most romantic gesture a guy could ever give. All right? When I was 17, I found out just how fast my Camaro could get me from Kissimmee to the beach. That was 26 minutes. Sorry, Mom. When I was 18, I met 2 random guys on a message board. Anyone remember message boards? On a message board, looking to start a Christian hardcore band in Orlando, Florida. And I convinced my parents to allow these 2 random guys to move from Seattle, Washington, into our living room for about 2 months until they got their feet established. Side note, that actually worked out really well. I'm still good friends with one of them. But still, that was foolish. Some of you guys are looking at me like, you're insane. Yeah, I was 18, whatever. At 21, I thought I had my entire life figured out, and guess what? I didn't. Look, all those moments, they have elements of foolishness to them. Like, regardless of where you think those foolishnesses fall, it doesn't matter, right? They all have elements of being foolish. In God, every single one of those moments, again, I can remember them for a reason, right? God used all those moments to teach me something about who He is, but also about who I am. And so I could probably open up the mic and give you guys the open mic time, but no one likes doing those things because it's really awkward and no one knows when to stop. So it's just going to be me today not stopping, right? So, but one of the most memorable moments of my foolishness came when I was a late teenager, because I had to wrestle with the question, when I opened this word, do I really believe what it says? And if you're never wrestled with that question, whether you're 16 or 60 or above, you will wrestle with that question. This question from my own heart really sat with me from the ages of 18 to 21. where I didn't straight out deny God, but I flirted with what it looks like to be the fool. You following me there? All right? And so it's a question and place where we all have been at one time or another, but it's a very real thing to walk through. And when you're in the midst of walking through it, it's kind of terrifying for someone who's grown up in the church, but then for someone who doesn't know, for someone who hasn't, it just doesn't matter to them. And so it's a really strange feeling, a really strange thing to walk through, but I'm thankful that God's grace brought me out to this place on the other side. So look, verse 1, let's read this. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds, there is none who does good. Well, thank you, David. That's a good start. All right? Like, as a Christian, you read that. If you're a believer in Jesus, if you're a Christian, you read that verse 1 through a really specific lens. And that lens forces you to say, well, how can people believe that God isn't real? Haven't they just looked around? Haven't they seen sin? Church, look at me. Follow me here. When was the last time you saw someone who's not a Christian actually refer to sin? When was the last time you actually had a Christian refer to God and understand the God of the Bible? Like, sometimes the answer to how can people believe that God doesn't exist, sometimes the answer is as simple as people don't believe God exists because they don't want God to exist. All right? But by rejecting God, rejecting all He has shown us, all that God offers us, all that He is, like, they reject God and end up they play the fool. So it says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And again, like, I want to emphasize, you're going to hear this a few times throughout this, but the reality is, like, let's not gain a prideful thought in the midst of that because we think we have it all figured out, because we don't. Let us not, as we sit, let the fool say in his heart, there is no God. Let us not get look, it can create a pridefulness in us because we're like, well, I'm not the fool. I don't say that. I don't do that. I don't hold to that. Because we have to define what a fool is. You with me there? All right, so the question is this, what is a fool? It's not someone who says or does stupid things. All right, we there, okay? A fool is not like this king's gesture wearing the three-pointed hat and juggling in front of the king and him going, ha, humor, right? That's not what he's doing, right? That's not what a fool is. When we describe what a fool is, we end up talking about the characteristics of what we associate a fool to be, not what a fool actually is, because those are two different things. See, when David writes about the fool, he is not, hear me, he is not talking about a lack of intelligence. When David talks about the fool, he's not talking about someone who we think is simple-minded. Many people who proclaim in this culture and in this life, there is no God, some of those people are some of the smartest people intellectually that I've ever met. I'm going to be honest. He isn't talking about a faulty, lack of intelligence. He's talking about a faulty heart and a faulty mind. He's not talking about immaturity. See, the word fool in Hebrew is the word nabal, and what it really means is a person who acts unwisely or impulsively, look, with the disregard of ethical truth. With the disregard of ethical truth. They use all those things with that disregard, okay? And so, when David writes, the fool says in his heart, there is no God, it's not this condescending like, there is no God. Harvard, yes. No, that's not that. What it is when he writes that, it's literally saying the fool says in his heart, nah, there's no God for me. It's a much more aggressive understanding of this verse. When he uses this understanding, it's not, well, there is no God. No, you simpleton. No, it's an outright rejection and rebellion saying, no, there is no God. Do you hear the difference? And it should create in our hearts an understanding of a difference as well. It's a no God for me. And what brings us to this point, again, isn't a lack of knowledge, it's our sin. When we live like God has no effect or no bearing on this world, we actually have the title of the fool. And it's not a title that's given to us. It's a title that we robe ourselves in. And we do that willingly. Like in verse 1, there are the distinctives of a fool. Like they're corrupt. They do abominable deeds. They just aren't good. And so the one thing we know is that a denial of God is often tethered to a wicked lifestyle. And I say often, but not always, because there are some people who we would consider morally good that are devoid of God. Will you follow me there? And so several weeks ago in Psalm 10, I introduced you to this term, practical atheism, which is, as a reminder, like in our own lives, we can end up denying God, but seemingly live a good, moral, normal life. And even us as believers, like we have to be careful that we don't fall into a practical atheism, even with the acknowledgement of God in our lives, but unwilling to give him authority. You following me there? Like too many of us, maybe not here, right? Maybe some of you, but we'll acknowledge God with our mouths, but our hearts are far from him. We'll say, yes, I believe in God. How can people say there is no God? But then the authority factor is me or us, not God. And that is a scarier place to be sometimes. And we look at this, and I look at 14, like the fool is not much different. Like, sometimes the fool doesn't even care if there's a God or not, such as long as if there is a God that he's benevolent and just leaves us alone. There's people out there that say, I don't care if God's real or not real. I don't care if he's fake, fairy dust, whatever. If the God is real, I just want him to be benevolent. I want him to be good to me. And I want him to leave me alone to do what I want to do. Like, that's our culture. I'm just going to be honest. If we actually have an honest assessment of our culture, that's where we're at. And the scary thing is when we do that, we end up asserting ourselves into places of ultimate authority. And this is where we begin to create a self-rationalizing life, a self-reliant life. And to them it's a big if God does exist, they really don't care if he exists. But even so for us as believers, we can resemble the fool. And that's the scary thing, because notice what David says. Look with me to verse 1. David says the fool believes where? In his, where? Heart. And what David is saying is at the very core of who we are lies what we believe. And when David talks about the heart, he's not talking about the blood-pumping muscle, okay? When David talks about the heart, he's talking about the core of what you believe. The core of what I believe, the core of what society believes. It's the source of all we hold to be true. Because notice that David says, the fool says, in his heart, and how we live and how we respond and how we worship are indicative of who you are. It's indicative of who I am. Again, we talked last week in the Gospels, it says, from your heart, what? The mouth speaks. And so that's the core beliefs of who you are. From there is what you say and from what you do. And so when David, we're sitting on this first verse for a while, for a minute here, right? But David says that the fool is corrupt, and that corruption is really the rootedness of the fool. From their corruption, their bad, I don't know what word I'm going to use there, right? Their poor view, their faulty view, of what's from in their core, that is how they respond. And it's not just what they do, but when David talks about corrupt, he's talking about who they are. It's a piece of them. There's no like, well, they're mainly good. I know we like to play that game because we don't like to offend anybody. Well, they're mainly good. People are mainly good. No, they're not. This says there is no one good. And so when David uses the word corrupt here, it describes the interior rotting of a person's personhood. And actually, the word corrupt here, when you do the direct translation, actually translates into souring milk. Question for you. Has anyone here accidentally ever drank souring milk? Just put your hand up. I just want to see this. Ew. Thankfully, I have never drank souring milk, but I came really close once. Really close. I had a roommate in college. He was actually a really nice guy, but he was a filthy roommate. Sweet guy, great guy, good friend, filthy roommate. And for all you wondering, no, I am not talking about me. All right? But he was notoriously filthy, so much so that out of the three guys that lived in this apartment, he got his own room because we were so grossed out. And a 20-year-old, 19-year-old guy completely grossed out by what's in his apartment. What's that tell you? Well, one time, I ran out of milk. And as good roommates do, we bought our own groceries because that's how you operated in college. And one time I was like, hey, I'm out of milk. Friend, I'm not going to throw his name out there. Friend, can I borrow some of your milk? I see you have some back there. And he's like, yeah, sure, no problem, bro. All right, cool. The moment that I took the top off, I could smell it. If you've ever smelled sour milk, it's not a pleasant smell. And my response to him was, hey, friend, I think your milk's bad. I will never forget his response. Oh, seemed fine yesterday. He was on the couch. I was standing in the kitchen by the sink. And when he said that, I proceeded to upend his milk container, and chunks came out. It was like slow motion, right? Now, I can only hope that the reason I was out of milk is because he was drinking my milk, because the words "seemed fine yesterday" and "chunky milk in the sink," they don't mix well. All right? But as grossed out as we are about hearing about that, like seeing what David writes, they are corrupt. Let that sink with your soul for a minute. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. And it is hard for us to wrap our hearts and our minds around that last phrase. Because for me, it's hard to wrap my heart around it sometimes. Like, I know it to be true, and I see it sometimes, but that line, there is no one who does good. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around that. Like, and writing about how our righteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, Paul quotes, as a part of Psalm 14, he quotes Romans 3, 10 through 12. And he in there, he mixes up a little bit of Psalm 5 and Psalm 140 and Psalm 10. But look at this cacophony mixtape that Paul creates in Romans 3. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless, and no one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. And their paths are ruin and mystery. In the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. That's Paul talking about how our unrighteousness proves God's righteousness. But do we sense a theme? Like that's like 5 different psalms completely mixed in and creates a little mixtape. But it could read as one. And like the definition of a fool in Psalm 14, Paul includes us all. And we all like to say that we are wise, that we have it figured out, that we are on the right side or the good side or the wise side of any given event. But we need to remember that sin makes us stupid. Paul Tripp writes this: what Psalm 14 reminds us of is that one of the terrible things that sin does to all of us is reduces all of us to fools. And what is the epicenter of that holiness, of that foolishness? It's a denial of the existence and the presence of God. Just let that sit on your heart for a minute, because ultimately, that is what the fool says. There is no presence of God. There is no existence of God. I am fine on my own. I live my own life. I'm self-reliant. I can take care of me. Don't worry about me. But we read things like Romans 3, and we read like Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 and all these different psalms. Like, it flips that on their head. Like, it says there's no one good, no, not one. Let's look at verse 2. It says, the Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. So, like, David moves from what David is seeing now to what God is asking. And so in verse 2, God looks down from heaven, and he cannot find one person who is seeking after God. Now again, thankfully, David is speaking in a little bit of hyperbole here, because in this, he has obviously not counted himself, and he has not counted God's righteous when he's talking about this. The verse 2 serves to expose just how seemingly devoid the world of God's faithful actually is. And I mean, let's be honest, like, the last time in the scriptures that God said, find me someone faithful, what ended up happening was that it was a destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so we see, like, as I read this, it creates in me that question. God looks down from heaven onto you, onto the children of man, to see if anyone understands, is anyone seeking after God. And as you read that, and for me, like, it created in me a sense of longing for God, but also flip that around. It reminds me and gives me a sense of the longing that God has for his creation as well. If God didn't long, God wouldn't look down. You following me there? If God didn't care, it wouldn't be God looks down from heaven upon his creation. It would be God is oblivious in heaven doing his own thing. But that's not what it says. And if we didn't long, we wouldn't keep on trying to put things in authority over us. If we didn't long, we wouldn't keep on trying to fill that void with something to make us feel. You follow me there? And so we see this. Like, get this picture. God is looking down and searching for somebody, anybody who is trying to do good and trying to understand. What does God see? Verse 3 and 4, he sees they all have turned aside. Together they become, there's that word again, corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. And then David says, have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as the bread and do not call upon the Lord? And so we see that David writes like this response from God here. He says, they all have turned aside. And my question is, from what to what? Because when you, hear me, when you turn aside from something, guess what you end up doing? You turn towards something else. When you turn from something, you turn from something to something. And so when we as humans turn aside, we turn from something to something else. And as humans, we always find something to fill the void. So when we say, well, I'm turning from this, we turn to something else and we fill that void there, right? So traditionally, right, addicts turn their vices into a hypervigilance. Smokers usually run from cigarettes to food. People turn from alcohol to consuming large quantities of Coca-Cola. From food to exercise, from self to religion, from religion to self, from God to self, right? You see where we're going here, right? Like, there's always an exchange. You turn from something, you turn towards something. And the question you have to ask your own heart is if you're turning from your sin, are you turning to God? Because if you're turning from your sin to something else, it ends up being from sin to sin, or from sin to vice, from sin to something else, if it's not going from sin to God. We exchange these things. And so verse 3, they all have turned aside. Together they become corrupt. There's none who does good, not even one. Verse 3 is the core of what, a term called human secularism. Verse 3 is the core of what that stands for. And human secularism is the idea that we as humans, we have the ability to be moral and to develop absolute truths apart from God. Human secularism ends up saying if we do good enough, then eventually the good will outweigh the bad, and therefore the good will become the prominent nature of humans and not the bad. But Psalm 14 shows us the full depth of the depravity of man. It doesn't say, David says, and God looked down and he saw that they were trying, and he said, well, they're trying to do good, so I'm going to be like, cheer them on. No, he says he saw the nothing. No one good. That's what the text is saying. But what's even crazier is that so often we come to this place where we feel like, well, I've been in church long enough, Andy. I've been a Christian long enough, Andy. I've been trying to live a holy life. And so we live a holy life, and for us, that becomes just who we are. Your holy life, if you say, well, that's who I am, wrong. Your holy life is only possible because of God's Spirit working in you and through you. You follow me there? And so we have a tendency to be like, well, Andy, I'm good. I go to church, I do things, I pray, I read my Bible, I'm good, right? Like, I'm fine. Wrong. Because the moment we start saying my goodness is my goodness and not the goodness of God working in me and through me, we've already begun to walk a path of idolatry of self. And so here's the thing, when that happens, as much as we want to focus on everyone else, when that happens, we begin to live like ones who think we are able to detect good from evil just by our own means and our own methods. And that's when we begin to put this word away and we just say, well, I know it all, I'm good, I know what it says, just listen to me. Wrong. We need to open this word so that we know what it says, so that we can know God, so that we can pursue Him. And then in this picture, God begins to shape us through His Spirit, shape us into the image of Jesus. This is a big theological word called sanctification, which means made and walking in the image of Jesus. It's a process. It's not an overnight thing. And that's okay. And here's a scary thing. In another lens, we are told and taught that goodness comes from within. We are taught that goodness comes from finding the truth and living our truth. It's terrifying, philosophical thought. In order to succeed in life, we're told you need to have self-esteem and self-worth and self-love. And look, those things in and of themselves, there is a bit of a necessity there. But to the point of turning aside from God to you is bonkers. Like Paul writes in 1 Timothy that in the end, people will be lovers of self and not lovers of God. Well, it's scary that we're seeing that, right? Like, and all those who turn from God, turn to self, they become, here's that word again, what we see in verse 3, they become corrupt. They become the spoiled milk. They become something that's not usable. And I don't know why, but when I read this verse, they become corrupt together. My watch too many movies mind, I begin to think about Finding Nemo, and all these stinking seagulls are going, mine, 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 mine. I don't know why. It just happens. But that's what I hear because, again, together they now have formed a self-inward opinion about who God should be. And it becomes my truth. It becomes my life, my body. And so they says together, like this life turned aside from God has become about them and for them and because of them. And so the corruption becomes so bad. Follow me. Let's look down here, verse 4. The corruption becomes so bad that David asked the question, have they no knowledge? Well, the question naturally comes out of that, well, if someone is lacking knowledge, like what do? We teach them, right? If someone doesn't know something, we teach them. Or if you're like me, if you don't know something, you find it on YouTube and you do it yourself. All right? What happens when your heart, the heart of the culture, the heart of the world, what happens when the heart becomes unteachable? What happens when your heart has become so hardened that you think you have it figured out, that no matter what is said, done, proclaimed, whatever, it just hits it and bounces off. So there's two things that we as believers, we can kind of infer and bring in from this text. One, they do have knowledge. It's been made clear to them. It's on the screen, Romans 1:18 through 19, right? Let's read that. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God has been made plain to them, because God has shown it to them." So there is a point to where there is knowledge that we have in our sinfulness suppressed. But here's the second thing. One thing we have to realize is that the culture today is that many people don't know. I am convinced, and many of my friends that are pastors are convinced, we do not live in a post-Christian world anymore. We live in a pre-Christian world. And what I mean by that is that we often are dealing with and engaging people who the same type of understanding that Paul was dealing with, or the disciples were dealing with, or other apostles were dealing with. It's not this cultural understanding, well, they know who God is, and they can just, come on. Church, our culture is dealing with, who's Jesus? I have no idea. Why do we celebrate Christmas? I have no idea. What is Easter? I have no idea. We have the attitude in church that they know where we are, they know what we're for, they know what we believe, so they can come if they want. Wrong. I hate to break it to you, but 25 years ago was the year 2000, not 1975. And I bring that up to say, we have a really warped view of what time looks like in our culture and in our lives. Because I'm going to tell you, in the 70s and the 80s, cultural Christianity was prominent. You couldn't really go very far without talking about Jesus, or at least meeting your neighbor or somebody who had at least a loose understanding of what Jesus or who he was. But now in 2024, when I talk to my neighbors, I get blank stares. Or I get some sort of warped pseudo-theology that, again, God is benevolent, he's good, he just wants me to be happy. And so, it's been made known to us as the believer to go and teach. Matthew 28 gives that, to go and make disciples. That means go and to teach. But for much of this, as we've already said, it's not the brain that's the problem. It's the heart. There is a disconnect between what the eyes of the wicked are seeing and what their hearts are allowing their eyes to see. There's a reason why the scales had to fall off Paul's eyes as he was healing from the road to Damascus. David writes that the evildoers eat up God's people. And David is calling it as he sees it. He is asking the question, do these people who refuse to acknowledge God, do they not see that they consume others and consume the righteous, that their wickedness is a means to their own end and destruction? All of that laid out now. Thankfully, there's a day where the wickedness of this life, the wickedness of this world will cease. Because verse 5 and 7, follow with me here. There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. If you highlight in your Bible or write in your Bible, underline that line, for God is with the generation of the righteous. It says, you would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, and let Israel be glad. It says, there they are. They are the wicked who have no knowledge. They are the wicked who have turned aside, who God looks down upon, who are the foolish. And David writes that the wicked are overwhelmed under the reality of the weight that is to come, but they don't know it yet. That's the contrast between the fool and the faithful. Is the fool has no idea what's coming down the road, and the faithful are praying and ushering in for God's return, for the return of Christ. Look back at the end of verse 5. Those words, again, should encourage you. For God is with the generation of the righteous. God is with those who are his people. His people are protected from the wrath that is to come, and he is their refuge, church. So when David writes that God is with the generation of the righteous, he's talking long term. He's using that word generation holistically, saying, if you are a part of God's people, he is with you from beginning to end. If you, a part of God's people, are pursuing him and you are saved by grace through his son Jesus, and this is for us as New Testament believers now, right? You are protected because God is your ultimate refuge. The best part of this psalm is right there. Once again, we're reminded that God is with his people and with the righteous. Like, this is the comparison of the full and the faithful. And so in some way, shape, or form, or maybe a variation of it, salvation is what humanity is waiting for. Some people, us as believers, we're waiting for Jesus to return. Some are waiting for a higher enlightenment. Some are waiting for this utopia society that can only manifest once people learn how to love and accept and tolerate the right way. But here's the thing. When I say that humanity is yearning for salvation, I have yet today, believer or non-believer, to ever meet someone to say, as they look around going, yeah, this is all right. Not one. Every single person on this world knows that something is broken. And at the end of this psalm, David is pointing our hearts towards salvation that is coming through Jesus at Zion. And we know as believers that salvation has already come, and it's Jesus. And even now, though he has come, we live in a world that has denied his reality, that has denied his existence, that has tried to bury him under everything. And Psalm 14 is undoubtedly one that Paul, when he wrote the New Testament, had etched into his heart. His letters to the churches and to Timothy and to the pastoral epistles, like, they are full of Paul reminding us, God's people, of the constant battle between full and faithful and what lies ahead for both. And so, in June of 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed for the Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168 people in 1995. Some of us remember watching that on TV. Even as a little, I was, hang on, 9. I was 9 when that happened, and I still, to this day, I don't remember I remember my parents watching this on TV. And it said that Timothy McVeigh, he made no statements. He didn't say anything as he got led to his execution, but on his cot in the jail cell, he left an excerpt of a poem by William Ernest Henley called Invictus. And here's the excerpt that he left. Out of the night that covers me black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. And yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul. That is written by a man being led away to his death. And he still is standing ardently, defiantly in the face of God. That is what Paul would say epitomizes the fool. And I suppose McVeigh's point is a truthful commentary of what many still believe, and that's a captain of their own soul. But we aren't, church. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5:15 that Jesus, he died for all, that those who might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake, he died and was raised. You heard that, right? Paul writes that Jesus died for all, that those who might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake, not for his own sake, he didn't need to do it, but because he looked down his creation and had compassion on his creation, he willingly went to the cross. He willingly took the nails. He willingly took the sin on his shoulders. Even when he asked the Father, is there some other way? And he heard silence. And he went like a sheep led to the slaughter. And he died, he was buried, and then on the third day he was raised to walk in a new life, in a resurrected life. And church, I need you to hear me when I say it, like, that's the gospel. So like, on one side of this, we're the fool. Outside of Jesus, we're the fool. And in Christ, we're the faithful. And again, there's an instantaneous change of the heart from fool to faithful in Christ Jesus. But it doesn't mean that your life is going to magically just go poof and look perfect. It doesn't mean that the consequences of your sin of the past aren't going to come back. It doesn't mean you're not going to have to deal with any of that things, but it means that you have a new heart, a new lens, and a new life in which to do it through. And so, each of us must carefully examine our own hearts and lives so that we don't become the fool, that we wouldn't be the fool. Like those who refuse to acknowledge Christ, David would say, is the fool. And when we continue to have the clear knowledge of Christ, but continue to sin, we are the fool. And when we claim Christ, but still cling to our sin, we're the fool. When we attempt to justify our own lives in our own way, not giving him authority over our lives, not giving Jesus the complete control over our lives, we are the fool. But Paul writes in Romans 10:9 and 10 that whoever confesses with their mouth and believes in their heart that Jesus is who he said he was, that Jesus took the sin of man onto his shoulders, that Jesus was put in the tomb, that Jesus raised, that those who would confess and believe in him, that is what we're offered, that Paul tells us in Romans 10:9 and 10. He tells us that Christ wants us to no longer be fools or lack knowledge, but he wants us to have a new change of heart, that we would pursue him, that we would live a new life that is rooted in him. And he has made himself known so that we can say with David, oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion when the Lord restores the fortunes of his people. Let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. Amen? And so, this morning, if you don't know this Jesus, this morning, if you realize, like, based on that, I'm a fool, you don't have to stay there. You don't have to live there. But you have an opportunity to respond to the glory of the gospel this morning, not of your own sake, but because of God working, and that you could be a part of the faithful. And so this morning, if that's you, as we sing this last song, man, I would encourage you to come up front. Pastor Andrew is right down here to your right, my left. I'll be down here to your left. If that's you, church, I want to invite you to come. If you want prayer, again, you can pull Pastor Andrew or myself. If you want someone to pray with you, come to the sides. If you say, hey, I want to pray, you want to pray for somebody, you want to pray for a salvation, whatever it might be, but you want to be kind of left alone, come more to the center. That's kind of our cue. All right? And so this morning, church, we live in a contrasted world of full and faithful. We are one of one. The question is, which one are you? So let's go ahead and stand this morning.